On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome to GLF Brave New Worlds Season 2. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Those of you who missed our earlier episode, The Majesty's Tiffany Sao in conversation with Manasi Subramaniam, you can catch this on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, and on our Facebook pages, JLF Litfest. You can also catch all our episodes from JLF London at the British Library 2020 if you haven't already seen them. Our next session today is the climate of history. Dipesh Chakrabarty in conversation with Navroz K. Dubash. This session is presented in partnership with the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. The dual crisis of climate change and the pandemic nudge us to recalibrate the assumptions about the centrality of the human experience and fellow human hubris in the age of the Anthropocene. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty flags urgent issues that confront the human species in a compelling conversation with Navroz K. Dubash. Dipesh Chakrabarty is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He is the author of Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference. He is the recipient of the 2014 Toynbee Prize, which is given to a distinguished practitioner of global history, and the 2019 West Bengal government's Tagore Memorial Prize for his book, The Crisis of Civilization, Explorations in Global and Planetary Histories. Navroz K. Dubash is the professor at the Center for Policy Research. He's been engaged as an activist, academic, and policy advisor in global and Indian debates on climate change, air quality, energy, and water for over 25 years. His most recent edited volume is India in a Warming World. All our sessions that have been broadcast till now are available, as you know, on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below, and these will be asked of our speakers at the end of the session. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, and in case we drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate of history, Dipesh Chakrabarty in conversation with Navroz K. Dubash. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sanjay. Well, I'm extremely honored to have the chance to chat with you, Dipesh, at the Jaipur Lit Fest, and thank you to the JLF colleagues. I think we've been charged with talking about the climate of history, linking things to COVID, and I think we will get to that. But, you know, I thought we might start by exploring, if you don't mind, a little bit of your own personal journey, of the sorts of ideas that you have worked with as a post-colonial scholar to begin with, and then moving over into a scholar of the Anthropocene and study of planetary consciousness and planetary systems. What has your journey been to explain some of these ideas that I think will be very useful when we actually turn to discussion of COVID? So
sure. But before I go on to talk about that, let me also say that the honor is mutual.
Thank you.
I've always enjoyed meeting you, always enjoyed reading you, always enjoyed talking to you. And I also thank Sanjay for giving us this platform to have a public conversation about these issues. In terms of my own trajectory, yeah, you're totally right. I was a Calcutta boy, born and brought up there through the tumultuous years when the left was on the ascendant.
Right.
So the issues really for me, I mean, I was a science student, but eventually became a historian. And the issues for me all had to do with class and inequality and capitalism and global capitalism and the injustices of unequal incomes, unequal distribution of wealth, you know, the normal kind of things that historians think about.
Right.
And in some ways, when I went to Australia to do my PhD, a lot of that work carried on into what became what gave me a position in so-called post-colonial studies, the book Provincializing Europe. I was still thinking about the legacy of European empires in our lives, and Provincializing Europe was really a book about what role European thought had played in shaping modern India, and what was our relationship to such thought, right? Given that we also came from deep and rich forms of other histories, whether it's Parsi history or Bengali history, they're all rich histories that go far back. So I was very interested in that question of how we translated European thought into our lives, and what they did with us. So the world, as it was, the physical world, I was always curious about it, which is one reason why I was a science student, but it didn't come into my historical thought or studies, right? I mean, so I had geology as a minor in my college days. And, in geology, you read about folds of rocks and faults in rocks. I'd only seen hand-drawn pictures of them. I actually physically saw them after I went to Canberra, because in Canberra you can drive around and see on a particular street a fold on one side and a fault on the other side. I said, wow, this is what I'd read about. But I was curious, but it wasn't, like geology was for geologists, biology was for biologists, right? Physics was for physicists. So if you read Mughal history and you read about a war in Mughal times, you thought about when a road was navigable.
Right.
Because it had to depend on seasons. And then we all sang praise of the asphalt and the building of all season roads. We thought this was modernity, like you didn't have to depend on the river's mercy for the river to be fordable, for a road to be passable. You could build all season roads, right? And they were called all season roads.
Yes.
So implicit in it was a story of human kind of mastery over the seasons. I mean, look, the seasons would come and go, but it wouldn't interrupt our lives. What happened, though?
Yeah, no, please, go ahead. I was going to say
that, yeah.
Please.
Okay. I was going to say that, so in my Calcutta life, nature was on screen. I mean, sometimes you go outside of Calcutta, but Calcutta was so built up and crowded that really, I mean, nature was fleeing Calcutta, as I was growing up. And for most Bengali intellectuals, these sickly looking, intense individuals were my friends. The body was something you remembered only when you had diarrhea or amoebiasis, which was very prevalent in Calcutta. The body reminded you of its existence through illness. Otherwise, the body was not something to think about, right? So physical nature was not something. Whereas in Australia, and particularly in Canberra, nature was all around you. Wasn't Indian kind of nature, wasn't lush and green. It was more spare, but beautiful in its own way. And I was young, and my Australian friends, who were all lovely young people, took me so completely into their lives that I became an outdoors person. I mean, quite a scandal for a Bengali intellectual to become an outdoorsy person. But I used to love going on bushwalks and things. And then what happened was, I left Australia in 95 to come to Chicago, but I go back every year, and my son still lives there. And every year I'd go back and enjoy the hikes, the bushwalks on the little hills that surround Canberra, except in 2003. I mean, Australia was in the grip of a big drought. And in 2003, there was a huge fire, like the fires going on in California now. Not as big as the fires that Australia suffered last year and into this year, but still very big. Right. And it destroyed hundreds of houses.
Or what California is going through in the West Coast is going through now. Yeah.
Exactly. And then all the nature spots I loved completely burnt out. Hundreds of thousands of animals died. Everything looked like they were scenes out of Mad Max. Right. And I was desolate. And the grass had all gone yellow for the drought. And I asked people around, and people said, look, this is not just the drought. We get seasonal droughts. This is climate change. And I said, what's climate change? And around 2007, in 2007, the IPCC report came out. Australia had elections where climate change became an issue because people were so scared. Canberra was suddenly had a lack of water. And they were fearing.
This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific body that...
the scientific body, exactly. And I saw in a rich country like Australia fear that Australia might no longer be livable. The biologist told me, we may have to become a water importing nation. Right. And what does it mean for our security? So I saw a rich country being fearful in a way that I'd never seen it being or never seen it anywhere else. So I got interested. I still remember that the grass eventually came back. When it came back, I sat down, two of my Australian friends, Ian McCalman and Marina Bollinger, and I said to them, look, I'm so delighted to have the grass back that I have to sing a Tagore song for you, which is about grass. I said, you won't follow it. I'll translate it first, then sing it. I forced them to listen.
Presumably by then they knew you well enough. So
yeah, they knew me well enough, and I forced them to listen to my Tagore song, which I think is a beautiful song, but might have sounded like a drone to them. But anyway, the grass came back. But I began to read up on climate change, and I was blown away to realize when the scientists were saying human beings have become a planetary force, right. And they were actually putting a number, kind of figure on it. So we are a geophysical force, and we are capable of changing the climate of the entire planet. Mm-hmm. Now, the climate of the entire planet is set by huge forces, like a huge volcanic eruption or the Milankovitch effect, as you know, the wobbles in planet's orbit, the glacial interglacial cycle. And they were saying we may have fended off the ice age that was due by anything between 50,000 to 500,000 years. And this was nothing like what I would have to think about as a historian. As I read more and more into it, I realized that what had happened, the global economy, with China's rise had led to more consumption. American consumption of clothes per capita has gone up more than 6 times. Once the manufacturing was sent abroad, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and clothes became cheaper.
That's an incredible number. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So I suddenly realized that the expansion of the economy, the expansion of the global middle class around 2000 was made up, or the bulk of it was made up of people in North America and Europe.
Right.
People in North America and Europe now constitute 30% of the consuming classes.
Yep.
Right? The bulk of them are now in Asia. Maybe it'll come up in Africa and other places. And I realized that the global economy had expanded so much that we were now impacting on forces that only specialists used to study, which we didn't have to reckon with in our normal economic calculations, in planning for the next 20 years. And that was the planet.
Right. And that's of course the key insight behind the idea of the Anthropocene, the fact that we're now in a distinct epoch where what you described.
Right. So that's what I realized, that we are on the cusp of the age of globalization and the planetary age. And the book that I've just finished, which is now in press with the University of Chicago Press, is coming out, which I've called it The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. Partly because the climate of history was the first essay I wrote out of this realization. Then, actually the first time I wrote it in Bangla.
Yeah. Yes.
Because in my head, I'm still a deeply Bengali person. Ashish Nandi says that, look, when I'm speaking English, I'm actually thinking in Bangla.
Please. No, I was going to say, I was fascinated to read in the Crises of Civilization, the book that you brought with OUP.
Right.
And I think you've mentioned this to me before, that essay, which has become incredibly well read and dissected, the 4 theses essay, the Climate of History 4 theses, as you said, you wrote it in Bangla first, and it more or less sank like a stone in India. And it's interesting that you basically say that, you talk about sort of the Bengali consciousness and not giving the body much consideration or the natural one. And maybe that's one reason.
That's what it is. I mean, friends said, it's interesting, but we don't think these things.
Yeah. And it's something I'd really like to come back to in this conversation. Yeah. What is it about the conversation here in India that short circuits these discussions? But we'll come back to that.
But Navroz, the interesting thing now was that, so I was invited to Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam last year. And I gave a lecture. I talked about climate change. And they were very interested. And then this year, a couple of lecturers in 2 different colleges in Kerala, got in touch with me saying, we're teaching this essay. and we would love you to come and talk to us. So I said, so next week I'm actually doing an online conversation with students in Kerala. But I did set them a task. I said, look, I'm not going to give a lecture. I want you to read that essay with your students and prepare questions.
Right.
So that I know that you've engaged with the essay in a particular way. And whatever your questions are, I don't mind. But we were going to have a conversation. It won't be a one-way lecture.
Right.
Because I want to know how you think. I want to know how young people think. And one of the fascinating things I remember, the fascinating part of the conversation in Kottayam was a physics professor, lady, stood up and said, look, Dipesh, the government isn't talking about it. But the fresh water in the coastal areas of Kerala were already becoming so salty that poor families were having a lot of trouble getting water for cooking.
Right.
So she said, actually climate change has come into our everyday life. But the political sphere still doesn't acknowledge it. Right. I mean, it doesn't acknowledge in most places. Let's be fair. India is not exceptional in that. And so the bigger question is India plus why in the world generally.
Right. Well, what I found always fascinating about your work, and you say you came to discussions of the planetary, understanding of these environmental issues, in the mid-2000s, sparked by that Australian fire. And I've been working in and around this area for a little bit longer, really since 1990. But I still find that when I read your material, it sort of holds up a kind of a critical mirror to the way I think about things. So there are lots of ideas that I don't realize are informed by certain mental constructs and frameworks. And I did find very useful when I went back to your book before just this week, thinking about this talk, your articulation of kind of of the global versus the planetary as kind of frames within which we think about things. I realized that despite being somebody who's worked on climate change, and you would expect me to be more aware and sympathetic of what you call a planetary consciousness, I'm firmly a global person in the sense that the way I think about this has that much narrower time frame. And I just wonder whether you could just explain to us, I found it a great read, a little bit more about those constructs as a way to actually talk a little bit about COVID, because I think it's very useful when you apply those ideas to the moment we're in.
But let me also talk about the Indian tendency, not just Indian, but generally the tendency to remain with what I'm calling the global, the story of the empire, the duplicitous past of the Western nations, the developed nations in dealing with us, the colonized nations, or the post-colonial nations. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that decision to remain firmly global or firmly critical of the West. I think there's a lot of wisdom. But what's interesting is that whether it's the responsibility of the West or whether it's the responsibility of, let's say, China now, China is really now a superpower. I mean, it's no longer a superpower in the making. It's become a super. If you look at the Belt and Road initiatives, I mean, it's a huge global grasp. There's no question. So whoever is responsible for it, at whatever time, in whatever way, the fact is that we are all forced today to think about what does excessive CO2 in the atmosphere, excessive in human terms, mean for human beings in the end. What does the warming of the seas mean, not just with sea levels rising, but with the seas become acidic? The seas become acidic might mean that you kill off small creatures or shell-making creatures. And if the planktons die, the planktons are a huge source of oxygen that the atmosphere needs. All I'm saying is, we are all becoming aware of these, and the pandemic exemplifies the global and the planetary in a very interesting way. I'm very glad you asked that question. So, what's global about pandemic? Clearly, what's global, on the one hand, is the fact that we live in crowded cities. That's a global trend. We travel a lot, which we're not able to do now. Right. So the pandemic travels with us traveling. But in a deeper sense, what's global, which now even somebody like Anthony Fauci acknowledges, saying that we are in an age of pandemicity. What's global is that it fundamentally has to do with the expansion of the global economy.
Right.
Because it's the expansion of the global economy that caused deforestation.
Right.
Deforestation has caused a crisis of wildlife habitat. Crisis of wildlife habitat means the coming together of wildlife species that didn't come together, and they're coming closer to humans.
Right.
Wildlife normally doesn't seek us out. They come closer to us only when we force them to be close to us.
Right.
And then think of the evolutionary thing. These coronaviruses, and there are hundreds of them in different kinds of bats, right? So viruses themselves, because viruses can only replicate through cells, so viruses are actually a part of the evolution of cellular organisms. So you and I are multicellular complex animals.
Right.
Viruses are an integral part of the cellular development. So they are, in a sense, pre-adapted to cells. And secondly, what has also happened because of the deforestation and things is that many of these viruses in the bat guts have now switched hosts and run into other mammalian bodies. Once that virus enters a mammalian body, it gets pre-adapted for human cells.
Right.
Right? So now that's the story of evolution. That's planetary.
Yep.
That's not global. So global is at the most 500 years.
Right.
The planetary is the story of evolution. See, bats have been around for 50 million years, much older species than us. Right? So, and the viruses, the microbes are.
I think that I read in your book that we've been around 300,000 years. So that's a big difference. Yeah,
that's a big difference.
Yeah.
And if you consider the pre-humans, the proto-humans, then a few million years maximum. But bats have been around for 50 million years, and the microbial, the archaea and the bacteria. I mean, these are primary forms of life. And the other thing you realize, and humans don't realize it often enough, is that the majority form of life on the planet, by weight and numbers, are microbial.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Right? So in some way, so as a historian, I often say to them that, humans need to think the way that minority communities have to think. See, minority communities can't, like the Muslims in India, the Parsis in India, they can't think out of majoritarian assumptions. Right? The Muslims in Bangladesh can. The Muslims in Pakistan can. I mean, the Parsis nowhere can.
No,
right? The Kurds.
Doesn't stop us, mind you, sometimes, but
probably identifying with the majority.
Mindset, yeah.
Identifying with it, but still, but if you think of the Parsi, and my friend Faisal Devji in Oxford has a very interesting book on Gandhi's time in South Africa, where he calls Gandhi the impossible Indian, and he says that Gandhi was somebody who, perforce, had to learn to think out of a minority position. Because he was defending people who were a minority.
That's actually very interesting, yeah.
And so I often say these days that humans have to learn to think as a minority form of life.
But do you take that as, so something in the blurb for this panel that, climate change and the pandemic, COVID, are both sort of humbling experiences in a sense. Right. And is that the sort of the common lesson that we learn, that humility, or does it go beyond that? I mean,
it's very, so there are two things to say there. It's not a humbling experience for everybody, climate change, by the way.
No, so not yet, unfortunately.
There are a lot of people who believe in climate science, but who therefore argue that since there is no nature that has not been fashioned by humans, which is frankly wrong, the core of the planet is still nature, and it hasn't been fashioned by humans. But anyway, they look at what they can see and they say, oh, everything is fashioned by human beings. Human beings should now take charge of the planet. So there are books like God Species. There are theses about the good Anthropocene. Even Alan Greenspan's The Planet in Human Hands ends up arguing that. And some, so that's where I think, I don't think actually that's a position of humility.
No, absolutely.
The more humble position is actually expressed by some geologists. There's some Australian geologist, Andrew Glikson, who actually says what we have lost is a sense of reverence for the planet. And see, when you look at the meaning of the word reverence etymologically means the combination of fear and respect, right? In other words, see, if you think of the globe, if you only think of the world as humans see it, you might think that today humans are central to it. This is our stage. The human drama is being played out on it. And you can see the mistake of scale that human beings make in every travel guide book. So travel books will tell you, oh, you're going to Spain. Go to that beautiful beach in the Basque Country. So for most humans, it's a beautiful beach without realizing that the beach actually has been crafted by geological forces. And if human beings could live for 20,000 years, the world would not at all seem as stable. As it's, so, it's a matter of scale. And one of the things I try to say is that the invitation in climate change is to expand our imagination so that you begin to realize how recent you are, how small you are, and how in caring for other human beings, you should also be respectful, be reverential towards the planet.
I found one way that you put that idea in some of your writing is the shift in mindset from thinking about the fact that we have a passively habitable planet to a consciously inhabited planet. So we inhabit and
absolutely
that planet, which is different from stewardship. I think
very different from stewardship.
It's not
very
about
different from
Christian ideas of stewardship. It's about a conscious inhabiting of the planet.
And
I think that is something that is again perhaps common from in terms of our approach to how we think about COVID, as well as it's a phrase that actually has resonance for both these crises.
Again, the thought can go two ways. So one form of humility could be in terms of a human withdrawal. Because one lesson of the pandemic, frankly, is that whenever humans withdraw, the air is cleaner, the sky is bluer, the waters are cleaner in the rivers, birds come back that you haven't seen for ages. Some animals come back, not all welcome, but some do come back, right? So you can see what human expansion has done to other species. I mean, the pandemic makes it visible. But there are two ways to go. Now, clearly, if the expansion of the global economy is destroying forests, the fundamental wise recommendation would be to contract the economy. But contracting economy is a very difficult proposition. I mean, look, the pandemic has forced us to contract. And what it means, I become poorer in my retirement. The very poor people, we saw it with the migrant workers.
Absolutely. What we've seen in India has been devastating.
Exactly.
It's not supportable.
It's not supportable. But even if you're practical, then the question of planetary governance comes up. So one problem we have, sorry, you're going to say something.
No, I'll come back to that thought. Please finish.
Okay, so hold on to your thought. Don't use.
I will. I'll write it down even.
Right. Okay. Good. So one practical problem that when I've been reading virologists since the pandemic broke out, just to understand, and also partly to mentally run my theory of the globe-planet distinction to the history of the pandemic, just to see if I was thinking right. And now I'm thinking by sitting besides the conservatives in the game, people who are not saying contract the economy, people who are rah-rah for the expansion of the economy, the virologists who actually want capitalism, they like capitalism. But even they say that they basically think that the way to manage future pandemics, by the way, we're in an age of pandemicity because there are many hundreds of other coronaviruses waiting.
Lurking in the wings.
To switch, lurking in the wings. And scientists have been saying this from 2007. We've been lucky so far that, Now, they've been saying, the people who want to work with governments, they've been saying that the WHO need more teeth. Nation states should not be able to control information about potential pandemics. So an epidemic breaks out in a nation state, there should be a global force that can go in and contain that epidemic there.
Yes.
With the help of the nation states, but the nation states will have to bow their heads to some other authority. Then that's really the story of how do we go beyond the UN structure, involving everybody. And that's why I'm saying that's where the planetary shows itself as a matter of management. Think of the Himalayan glaciers. Rivers coming out of the Himalayan glaciers service 7 countries, from Pakistan to Vietnam. There's no treaty among these nations about how to manage the health of the glaciers. If the glaciers go, we all go. But every nation state treats the rivers as their own.
Yep. Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that.
You know, I think this illustrates a real tension, right? Because you're basically, what it says to me is, so you know, you have a force that goes in if there's a pandemic, and you have to sort of accept that erosion of sovereignty, if you like, and it almost says that generation of a planetary consciousness at a scale that is sufficient to allow that sort of intervention is what is needed. And now coming back to the thought I had, you said, well, from a practical point of view, and I want to sort of now kind of turn this to climate change. Somebody who's been active in the climate debate for a long time, I have this discussion with my younger colleagues all the time. For them, it's very much about understanding the scale and scope of the crisis, developing a sense of urgency, and in fact, consciously thinking in terms of the planet. And somebody like myself, who's been at this for 25 years or so, says, you know, I don't think we're going to get there in time. And so my practical thinking is actually even to shrink, forget about the planet, forget even about the globe. Action happens when nation states decide, for reasons that have nothing to do with climate change, that they want to move in a particular direction. Invest in renewable energy because of energy security, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, you know, get the whole world hooked on cheap Chinese solar panels. And so ironically, what may save us is a shrinking of the scale at which we think about this. And these are two very different.
No, this is, but see, one can participate. No, I actually don't think it's, see, so shrinking is one metaphor through which you can think of the relationship. Another way to think of it might be scaling, right? So with scaling, what happens is, so let's say the University of Chicago, for me, and I'm like a worm on the ground looking up, and looking up, I see the dean, the sub-dean, then I see the provost, their office, and then that, you know, the supreme or the president somewhere. And when the president looks down, the American president or prime minister in India does it all the time. So we both, I'm scaling up and he has to scale it down, right? So he makes me into a number. You know, I'm part of the total amount of the salary budget for the University of Chicago.
And then we talk about the students and where they are on this hierarchy.
Right, exactly, where they are, exactly. The students, in my terms, I often tell them that, you know, they're like a guerrilla force without a base. So, you know, in my Maoist years, when I used to read Mao Zedong, Mao was always saying a guerrilla force needs a base, like human beings need a bottom to sit on. Right? And the students have no place to sit. They go from one class to another. If they have to sit, they have to go to a restaurant or they have to go to the library. You know, there's no place that they can call their own. You're totally right. But what I'm saying is that these big things actually are sometimes scaled into our small lives. To give you an example, this human dominant consciousness that the world is there for us to enjoy can be performed in the life of an individual consumer without thinking about the world. Right? So look at all the construction boom in India. And everybody who now builds a new apartment has a nice, beautiful kitchen with either a granite slab or, you know, some other marble bench for the kitchen bench, right? And they don't make a connection between their desire to do that and reports saying 31 hills have been razed to the ground in Aravalli range in Rajasthan, illegally, because of illegal quarry. Or in West Bengal, and I'm sure it's true of other parts of India, there's constant news in the newspaper about sand being illegally dredged out of rivers. But you know how the story shows up. There's one really very poignant story. Some boys had gone for a swim in the river. They were not very good swimmers. The river used to be shallow. They didn't know that the dredging of the sand had made the river deep, and one of them died. Now, see, that's how a big environmental story comes into our life as a tragedy. So it's really a question of, I think it's absolutely fine where you work.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The idea of scale.
Scaling. How do you scale a big story into your life?
That's right. No, that's very helpful. It's very helpful. Yeah. Dipesh, I see some questions showing up on the chat, and it'd be good to get some voices in here. So maybe I'll just pick a couple of these. One question from Arjun Bhatia says, with figures like Greta Thunberg emerging in the climate discussion, do you see a future where these new voices will actually be heard? Do you believe their voices are gaining more prominence? Do you see, relating back to what we've talked about, do you see that coming out of a sort of a different sort of consciousness of earlier generations?
Well, I mean, she did play a role in actually making, in ways you might approve of or not approve of, actually making people more aware of the problem. Yep. And school children were aware of the problem. There are a lot of sort of copycat school children's strikes throughout the world, inspired by Greta Thunberg. But actually, I was in Paris when some of this was going on, and people were really in two minds about the figure. There were couple of things. One was, of course, people were in two minds about using somebody who's not an adult, or staging somebody who's not an adult to pronounce things in such a forceful manner. That some people thought was not right. But whatever the debate, having a debate is good because it puts the issue on the agenda. Yeah. And then you can make up your mind about which way to go.
No, I agree. And I think she and their movement has been very useful from that point of view. My slight concern is there are multiple ways of talking about this in multiple contexts.
Sure.
And for the same reason that your Bengali version of Climate of Theses may not have got the attention it deserved right away there, similarly, I think there are different languages that we perhaps need to use.
The public sphere is a very, but you know what? But what I do observe as a continuing tradition in the West is that the West has the gumption or the chutzpah or the hubris to speak about the entirety of humanity. Right. The simple fact, I have not seen an Indian book written for the hoi polloi explaining the science of climate change.
Right.
To give you an example, just last week's Economist has a review of Daniel Yergin's book on oil and politics of oil, right? And I was happy, but I was also very surprised to see the reviewer refer to my thesis on climate of history thesis. Right. So see how quickly the take-up is of different things. So if India wants to be a global power, and now I'm speaking nationally, somewhere a country that wants to be a global power has to develop the hubris, if you want to call it so, to think for everybody.
Yeah, and certainly that is not where we are going. We could explore that theme much more, but let me get another question in because there are very interesting questions coming through. So we have a question from Brinda Arora who asks, how can we conceptualize and explore the relationship between nationalism and climate change? Which does get back a little bit to what we were just talking about. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are climate-friendly nationalisms and climate-unfriendly nationalisms. And nationalism, a very simple thing, a nationalism that just goes on saying vikas, 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 and only plays lip service to the Aravalli Hills problem. Now, that is clearly an environment-unfriendly nationalism, and it will lead us to the wrong place in the long run.
Right. Well, you know, I think at the same time as you say vikas, this government also celebrates awards from UNEP for being champions of the earth and pats on the back globally. So and even as it is under fire right now for diluting the environmental impact assessment notification. Right. So I think there's a kind of they're duality. Able to get away somehow with this duality.
Yeah. And also, mind you, some of these global awards are actually to encourage somebody to correct their behavior. Yeah. Now, you say to a very naughty boy, that's a good boy. Yeah. Not because the boy is good, but because you want the boy to be good.
Well, unfortunately, what happens is that the naughtiness or the goodness depends on what the rest of the class is doing. And at the moment, that is where India has an advantage, because the rest of the class is falling behind.
And I gave you the Kerala example, where actually climate change is an everyday issue for the poor families in terms of cooking or water. And the physics professor was telling me, the politicians don't care. Think of the Chennai floods.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Climate comes into our life refracted through what we actually do
Right.
in our politics, in our economy. So there's really, so I totally agree with you. I think there are multiple kinds of possible nationalisms. And not all have to be climate unfriendly or unfriendly towards the environment.
Right. And I guess the trick is also, how do you even harness nationalism, which is a very powerful force, because we probably need all the tools we can get right now. There's one, maybe we have time for one more question and then a discussion following that. So Akib Ali asks, how does climate change shape our behavioral pattern? Or perhaps it should be, how could it shape our behavioral patterns and why? So sort of, down to the level of the individual, perhaps, and behavior.
There's a very good discussion of that in Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, the behavioral economists, and
Right.
book called Nudge. And Nudge has a chapter called Saving the Planet.
Right.
And it's all about whether an individual should be nudged, what kind of nudge an individual should be given, and they're clearly in favor of an incentive model of nudge. But look, there's so much, the more we talk about climate change, is bound to have impact on our behavior, even in small scale. Like, you think about how much electricity you burn, you think about how much the car you drive, do you go for an electric car? All of those are good things.
Right.
And all of them have to be welcomed, irrespective of whether we can solve the climate problem as a whole.
Yep.
But these piecemeal behavioral options are all things we need to think about.
One of the things I find interesting about the behavioral question is that in a country like India, in a sense, you have a lot more scope to shape behaviors because we haven't built infrastructures that provide that sort of meta nudge. So, for example, public transport systems, the availability of public transport systems definitely shape behavior. Have we decided that we want to build our cities around the private car, around public transport, around walking? The West has had that conversation, and that door is largely closed. We have a crack open in that door. We could actually think about this a bit more.
But there, the example of air conditioners in Delhi that some New York journalists have studied, and my colleague Michael Greenstone has studied. It's fascinating where people are actually investing in their first-time air conditioners, which are actually improving their life and life quality, no question. But at the same time, destroying the future of the city.
Right.
It's just heating up the city even more. So there are these trade-offs we make in everyday life, and somehow I feel that's why you can't leave it to if the government doesn't intervene and make it easier for people to make the right choice.
Absolutely. In that case, what the government needs to do is have building codes that allow for more passive cooling, where you have the same thermal comfort but without an air conditioner.
So that people don't have to individually make these market-based choices. And also, at the Riga, at the conference on air conditioners in Rwanda, India actually bargained to be one of the slowest changing countries.
Absolutely.
And that's again, it's a package of wrong decisions put together.
Yeah. It comes back to the earlier part of our conversation where we talked about India operating very much in a sort of a neocolonial kind of mindset.
And we are still victims.
That's right. And we've approached climate negotiations in that way. And ultimately, we might be among the worst affected. But we have to sort of square that circle.
Also, Navroz, it's so, I think the victim psychology was somewhat there in Nehru too. But it's so different from what Gandhi was. Gandhi was one person who decided not to be a victim. And that's why he was much more sovereign in his imagination of what to do, right? And that's the advantage of not think of yourself as a victim. Then you see that you are a sovereign, you have more autonomy, and you can do more things. But sure.
So Dipesh, I think we are close to ending, but maybe I could just ask you, to many of the young folks who are beginning to think about climate change along with, and now COVID, along with the kinds of concerns that animate, young people about sort of local politics, disenfranchisement of minorities and so on and so forth. What is sort of a concluding word, things that sort of an idea or a piece of the imagination that sort of really helps carry them towards this?
Particularly if I'm speaking to an Indian audience, the example I'll give is that of Rohit Vemula. Now, think of this man who identified with the Dalits, who killed himself. But in his suicide note, he said there were two ways out of being in imagination. There were two ways out of him being considered an oppressed person. One, he said, was that I should be considered as a mind, the autonomous human being, sovereign human being. Or, he said, which was fascinating because he was an avid student of Carl Sagan, he said, or as a piece of ancient stardust. And stardust was not a reference to the film magazine. He actually was referring to the fact that molecules from ancient stars are constantly being recycled in the universe, and they're going in and out of our bodies. So he had this planetary cosmological understanding of himself. So, and where would I find a better example of a young person who was completely against the oppression, the casteist oppression of our society, but who himself was open to the question of not just being universal, but being cosmological in his imagination.
That's a wonderful, wonderful sort of set of parallel images to end on. Thank you so much, Dipesh.
No, thank you, Navroz.
I've really
always
enjoyed
wonderful
the
to see you and
conversation.
talk to you.
Thank you.
And thank you to JLF again for making it possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, and thank you, Navroz Dubash. That was fascinating what you ended with, a bit of stardust. But even while this conversation was going on, I was actually looking through social media, and what I found was that just today there's two reports that I want to touch upon and ask you to comment. One is that the US has spent 700 billion on the military and 15 billion on climate change, or how to bring about a change. And the NASA report that came out today said that by 2100, emissions will have added 15 inches to the global sea level. My question to both of you is, what is it that we need to do across the digital space, or across the media, or across education and knowledge spaces, to really make this a practical issue of survival, of life, and not just about the stardust traveling, but really about the future of the human being? And any comments, ending
Sanjay,
comments?
very quickly, Sanjay. Again, it's a quick comment, so it doesn't really address the entirety of your wonderful observations. We need to go to people to whom belongs more of the future. In other words, young people. And India is a young country, so we need to make people in high schools, people in colleges, people outside of these but young, aware of the problem we face, and encourage them to think locally, nationally, globally, and planetarily. That would be my very quick response.
Navroz,
to that
comment?
You know, well, obviously, everything that Dipesh said is completely, you know, the direction we should be traveling. The only thing I would add, perhaps, is that we have to kind of find a way. Picking up on what Dipesh said, this idea of scales or scaling. We have to find a way where people can think about
scaling,
a global future that is consistent in a way that allows them to scale the idea to something that is tangible in their day-to-day lives, because otherwise it becomes unmanageable.
Yeah.
We have to provide them sort of that translation function between scales.
Absolutely.
And because then people are empowered. Otherwise, I feel sometimes the planetary can be overwhelming and disempowering.
Yeah, and we need to create syllabuses, we need to create activities. So what we need, Sanjay, to come back to your question, we need a bunch of climate activists who are not politically committed to any one party. Because the parties, as they're structured, are not interested. Because the parties think of the vote in the coming elections, and then they make that the priority. So again, so anyway, that's kind of a very broad.
No, thank you. Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, and thank you, Navroz. I have to shamelessly plug the fact that, you know, when we started the Jaipur Literature Festival and we started JLF Brave New World and Words Are Bridges and everything that we do, this has always been sort of our cornerstone. Can we reach out to young people across the socioeconomic segment? However, sometimes we fear that, you know, we may have reached out to millions of people. But is that enough? And
may I ask you a quick question in that respect? Is what do you do with the digital divide?
It's huge, and I've been shouting and screaming this from the rooftops, Professor Chakrabarty, saying that, like English in places like India
Right.
and so many other countries, has created the chasm, 60s, 70s, and beyond that. Today, the big chasm is those who have bandwidth and those who don't.
Those who don't.
We work in the craft and the artist and the artisan segment, and we are seeing that. So it's all very well talking about digital India with a 5% spectrum bandwidth, etc.
But
How do these people even get access? I mean, one of the things that I do is we work with street children, and the families on the street, or even our kids in our homes. How do they do their classes? I mean, smartphones. Each one of them has a computer on the street. What are we saying? When you're saying, don't leave your home.
Right.
I mean,
where do they go?
I will agree with that. I will agree with that, but it is also true that, ironically, the pandemic has actually helped, in part, very, very partially, erode a little bit that digital dividend.
Of the divide.
But what has happened, I think,
I'm sorry,
Navroz, which has been fantastic, is that it's helped everybody make that leap because they have no choice.
That's right.
And even the craftsperson, whether it's in Falaudi or the craftsperson in Varanasi or Chikmagalur, is making the effort to become a far more savvy in terms of taking the photograph, trying to upload it.
But it's not costless. It's not costless at all.
No.
And we're seeing this new divide, and we've been screaming, or certainly I've been screaming from the rooftops.
Sure.
Not that anybody is listening, but hey.
Well,
but
someone will listen.
Thank you both so much, and thank you to the University of Chicago and all our many colleagues who made this possible. On behalf of all of us, truly, we are extremely grateful to have been able to take JLF Brave New World forward. This particular session, as you all know, was presented in partnership with the University of Chicago, the Center in Delhi. Thank you all for that. And please do remember to log back on next week on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, to continue watching sessions on JLF's Brave New World Season 2.